In Squid Game, survival usually follows a pattern. The strongest players dominate early, the smartest players try to control the game, and the most confident ones believe they can make it all the way to the end. But almost every time, those are the exact players who fall first. Because strength makes you a target, intelligence can make you overconfident, and confidence itself can turn into the one mistake that gets you eliminated. So when you look at someone like Minsu, he shouldn't even be in the conversation. He isn't physically dominant, he doesn't take control of situations, and he doesn't carry himself like someone who's built for a game like Squid Game. If anything, he looks like the type of player who should have been eliminated early. He's quiet, he's hesitant, and most importantly, he's afraid. And in a game where fear causes people to freeze, panic, and make fatal mistakes, that should have been his downfall. But it wasn't. Because somehow, while stronger players were getting eliminated, while smarter players were overthinking, and while more aggressive players were turning themselves into targets, Minsu kept surviving, and not by accident, because the more you look at how he plays the game, the more you realize something important. Minsu doesn't just survive despite being quiet, afraid, and overlooked. He survives because of it. And once you understand why, you start to realize that players like him might actually have the best chances of making it to the end. The biggest thing about Minsu is that he avoids conflict at almost every opportunity, and at first, that might seem like fear, or weakness, or even hesitation that should get him eliminated early. But when you actually look at how he moves through the game, it starts to look a lot more intentional than it appears on the surface, especially in Season 2, where this pattern becomes very clear. During the special game, while other players are actively engaging, arguing, or positioning themselves for control, Minsu consistently places himself out of direct danger. He doesn't try to assert dominance. He doesn't try to influence outcomes, and he doesn't force himself into situations where he could become a target. Instead, his priority is simple: stay out of reach of immediate harm. And that pattern repeats itself in the first few games of Season 2 as well. While more aggressive players create tension, form early conflicts, or attempt to establish control over others, Minsu does the opposite. He stays quiet, he observes, and he avoids anything that will make him noticeable in a system where being noticed is often the fastest way to die. But the clearest example of this mindset comes during the bathroom fight. When the conflict breaks out, most of the players are forced into one of two roles. Either they fight or they get pulled into the chaos. Minsu is different. He's the only one who actively removes himself from the situation. Not because he doesn't think he can win, not because he's trying to prove anything, but because he understands something very basic about the system he's trapped in. Survival comes first, and pride comes second. He doesn't have the mindset of someone trying to win the fight. He has a mindset of someone trying to escape it entirely. And that difference is crucial, because Minsu isn't driven by ego, he isn't driven by dominance, and he isn't driven by the need to prove himself stronger than others. He's driven by one thing: avoiding elimination. That means he's willing to let other players destroy each other if it means he doesn't have to participate directly. And over time, this creates a very specific advantage in the game. Minsu becomes neutral, not aligned with aggression, not associated with leadership, not known for betrayal or violence, just present, but not threatening. In Squid Game, that kind of identity is incredibly valuable early on, because it reduces your visibility. Players who are loud, aggressive, or dominate naturally attract attention. They become threats in other people's eyes, and that makes them targets. But Minsu avoids all that by simply not participating in the behaviors that create enemies in the first place. Instead, he gets louder, more aggressive players make the decisions. He lets them create the conflict. He lets them expose themselves. And while they're busy doing that, he adapts, he learns, he watches patterns, he survives through positioning rather than control. We see this mindset carrying to the early parts of Season 3. On the red team, even though he's still clearly afraid of the violence around him, and still hesitant in confrontational situations, especially when facing players like Namgyu, he doesn't let emotion override his survival instinct. Instead, he makes a calculated choice. He chooses to stay on the knife team, especially because avoiding Namgyu in immediate danger gives him the highest chance of staying alive in that moment. It's not bravery, and it's not dominance. It's selection. He consistently chooses the option that minimizes risk, even if it doesn't give him control or power. And that's the key difference between Minsu and most other players in the game. He doesn't survive because he's the smartest, strongest, or most chaotic. He survives because he refuses to become the center of attention inside it. Every decision he makes early on is about one thing: moving forward without creating unnecessary risk. No overconfidence, no aggression, no attempt to prove himself, just controlled avoidance of situations that could lead to his elimination. And in a system where most players die because they either act too aggressively or think too far ahead and overcomplicate things, Minsu's simplicity becomes his advantage. He doesn't try to beat the game early, he simply tries not to lose it. Even though Minsu survives the earlier parts of his journey by staying out of danger and avoiding direct conflict, there eventually comes a point where that strategy alone is no longer enough. The hide-and-seek game forces him into a situation where avoidance stops being an option. For the first time, Minsu can't just observe from the sidelines or wait for others to create openings. He must act. He has to make decisions in real time, under pressure, where hesitation itself becomes dangerous. And it's in this moment that the pills become a turning point, not just for Namgyu, but for Minsu as well. Because just like we saw in my last video, the pills don't simply enhance a player's abilities, they alter their perception of reality. After taking them, Minsu begins experiencing hallucinations. He sees Semi, the one person he genuinely trusted in the game, someone who represents safety, familiarity, and emotional grounding for him. But he also sees Namgyu, tied to the moment where he kills him, though in reality, it isn't a clean or straightforward action. It's distorted, shaped by the psychological effects of the pills and the chaos of the situation, where the shaman is actually the one on the other end of the knife. Without the pills, it's likely Minsu never reaches that point of aggression. He doesn't have the same emotional push, and he probably continues his strategy of avoidance and survival through distance. But the pills change that entirely. They don't just give him confidence, they distort his emotional boundaries. And in that distorted state, Minsu becomes capable of doing things he normally wouldn't consider. His actions become less about strategy and more about immediate survival instinct, filtered through hallucination and pressure. This is the moment where his earlier passive strategy evolves, because once he gets through this stage, he doesn't return to being purely avoidant anymore. He carries momentum forward into the next game, the jump rope game, where he is no longer just surviving by hiding or staying neutral. Now he has experience, pressure exposure, and most importantly, he has already crossed a psychological threshold where he has taken decisive action that permanently changes how he operates. That momentum, combined with the advantages he gains over Namgyu, who he indirectly outlasts through the chaos of the later games, allows him to move into the final stages of the competition. For the first time, Minsu is no longer just a quiet observer in the background. He's a surviving presence in the endgame. And while the pills play a major role in helping them reach that point, they also introduce the cost that eventually catches up to him. Because the same thing that allowed him to push forward, his altered mental state, also becomes unstable over time. And that instability, especially in the form of withdrawal and psychological strain, is what ultimately leads to his collapse. Still, even with his eventual downfall, Minsu's position in the game is undeniable. Out of 456 players, he survives all the way into the top 9, not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he understood something early on. Survival isn't always about control, it's about timing, caution, and knowing when not to be seen. And in his case, the pills become a predictable factor that pushed him beyond what his original strategy alone could have achieved. All in all, across seasons 2 and 3, Minsu was never the type of player anyone expected to make it far. In almost every situation, there were always other players who seemed like better candidates for survival. Players with more aggression, players with more control, players with clearer leadership qualities or more defined strategies. And compared to them, Minsu often felt like someone who was simply there. But that's exactly what makes his survival so interesting. Because every game he participates in, excluding the final one, he doesn't try to force outcomes. He doesn't try to control the environment around him. And he doesn't try to take center stage in situations where attention can be dangerous. Instead, he flows through the game. He adapts to what's happening rather than trying to dominate it. When danger appears, he avoids unnecessary risk. When conflict breaks out, he doesn't escalate it. And when decisions need to be made, he tends to choose the option that allows him to continue forward with the least exposure. And over time, that creates a very specific pattern. Minsu survives not because he's shaping the game, but because he's not resisting it. He lets louder, more aggressive players define the direction of each situation, and then he positions himself just far enough away from the center of attention to avoid becoming a target. And in a system like Squid Game, where visibility often leads directly to elimination, that approach becomes unexpectedly effective. But what makes Minsu especially compelling is that he doesn't feel like an exaggerated or unrealistic type of player. In fact, he feels like the closest representation of what a normal person might actually do in this situation. Someone who is scared, someone who's uncertain, someone who doesn't want to be there in the first place, but is still forced to continue moving forward. Because if you strip away the games, the structure, and the extreme circumstances, Minsu's mindset is surprisingly relatable. Most people wouldn't enter a situation like Squid Game as a strategist or a dominant force. They would enter it cautiously, carefully, trying to survive from one moment to the next without drawing attention to themselves. And that's exactly what Minsu represents. Not a genius player, not a natural leader, not a confident figure in the game, but a survivor in the most realistic sense of the word. Now, of course, that doesn't mean his journey was free of fear or uncertainty. He was scared, he hesitated at times, and he was forced into situations where he had to act under pressure rather than ideal conditions. And in that sense, he also benefited from moments of luck, timing, positioning, and the unpredictable nature of the games themselves. But that's also the part of what makes his survival feel grounded. Because in reality, survival isn't always about perfect execution or extraordinary ability. Sometimes it's just about making it through each situation without making a fatal mistake. And Minsu does exactly that for the most of the competition. He doesn't win because he outplays everyone else. He wins because he avoids the kinds of decisions that eliminate people early. However, even that kind of survival has limits, because as the game progresses and the pressure intensifies, the system begins to punish instability more harshly than caution. And for Minsu, that breaking point comes in the final game. The hallucinations, the strain of being isolated, and the effects of withdrawal all begin to stack on top of each other. The same traits that allowed him to survive early on, his passivity, his dependence on external stability, and his reactive rather than controlling mindset, start to work against him in an environment that demands absolute mental control, and as a result, he becomes the first person to die in the final game. Not because he was the weakest player in the games, but because the system had finally reached a point where survival required more than just caution. It required stability under extreme pressure, and for Minsu, for all his realism and relatability, was never fully built for that level of intensity. Still, that doesn't take away from what he accomplished. He still made it to the final challenge without being at risk of elimination in the earlier games, not through dominance or manipulation, and not through exceptional skill, but through patience, awareness, and the ability to move through the game without ever fully becoming consumed by it. And in a way, that's what makes his journey stand out the most. Because while most players in Squid Game are defined by how they try to control the system, Minsu is defined by how he survives it without ever trying to control it at all. Minsu's story isn't really about dominance or intelligence, it's about endurance in the simplest form. He never takes control of the game, and he never needs to. He just keeps moving forward until the system stops allowing that kind of survival. And in the end, that's what separates him from everyone else who didn't make it as far. If you enjoyed the breakdown, like and subscribe for more Squid Game analysis, and drop a comment on who you want me to cover next. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.